We are live.
All right, thank you so much, Kim. Well, welcome everyone to our Advancement and Development Subcommittee meeting. Kim, if you could please put the slides up. Thank you. So in today's meeting, we do have a really jam-packed meeting. This is our last opportunity to engage in some conversations around the advancement and development roles and responsibilities and to finalize our work before we begin moving into the phase where the draft proposal is going to pull together all of the different pieces of the talks that have been happening in all four of the subcommittees. And so we do have a lot of work to get through today. Kim, if you could please go to the next slide. Okay, so first, we're going to do the approval of the agenda. Kim did send that agenda out to you via email, and then we're also going to approve our minutes. So if I could please have someone make a motion to approve the agenda that Kim sent out earlier this week.
Subcommittee.
Thank you. And if I could please get a second.
Second.
Thank you. All right, so the agenda has been approved. And now we'll move on to the meeting minutes from our July 15th meeting. These were also sent out by Kim in advance. So if you please could have someone make a motion to approve the July meeting minute. Sorry. We could please have someone make a motion to approve the July 15th meeting minutes. Or if there's anyone who had anything that they needed to correct or to bring up that they saw in those minutes that we needed to clarify or correct, if you could please bring that up at this time.
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you. And do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. So the meeting minutes from July 15th have been approved. Now, the first thing I wanted to do this morning was to do a quick overview of the feedback that we've received from teachers across the state, other stakeholders across the state, also from NCAE and from NCACTE. And there is a lot of really great information in all of those different documents. Kim did attach them all to the email that went out with our meeting materials. So if you haven't had a chance to read through those, I do highly encourage you to read through all of the comments that were made by all of the different stakeholders that are providing feedback on the current draft proposal. I'm going to go over specifically the pieces that are related to A&D so that we're able to keep those pieces of feedback in mind as we go through our discussions today. But like I said, there is a lot of other feedback in there that's really great that is related to the other subcommittees. So I do encourage you to read that if you have not already had a chance to do so. I did also want to thank one teacher in particular, Linda Conarn. She provided some specific and actionable feedback in her comments that included ideas for solution. And she also identified specific flaws and concerns and gave us justification and explanation of how those flaws and concerns were universally applied to teachers across the state. And so that feedback was excellent because it really helped me find some different places where maybe we need to lean in on A&D. And so I just wanted to thank her for providing such specific and actionable feedback, along with some solutions of things that we can do maybe to address some of those concerns that she had. And for all the other teachers who provided feedback, thank you very much. It was very important for us to hear your ideas, to hear your concerns, and to understand where there are flaws in the current system. And so I appreciate everyone who did submit feedback to the Pathways feedback email address. And if you have continued feedback, please be sure to keep sending that information into us so that we're able to use that as the draft model is developed and is completed. So thank you also very much for providing that feedback. And then we're going to go over the specific measures for competencies in L1 through L3. So Kim did send out the INTASE model core, our standards for model core teaching. So we are going to be using that as we go through that discussion. So if you haven't already pulled that up from the email, you might want to pull that up in the background on your computer so you can reference it as we are going through that discussion. We're also going to talk about the verification process. So will there be a range of testing that needs to be met, and how will teachers move into those advanced teaching licenses? And then finally, we're going to discuss some guidelines for the professional advancement accounts, and then we will adjourn the meeting. Now, you can see we do have a really packed agenda today, and we have a lot of information that we really do need to go over and try to get some final ideas gathered from the group. And so what we've decided to do is to put a limit of 2 minutes per person per topic on spoken comments. And so Kim will be keeping a clock as people start making comments so we can keep track of when you've reached that 2-minute threshold. But we still want all of your ideas to be gathered and collected, and we recognize that 2 minutes may not be enough to fully gather everyone's ideas. So if you have something that you want to say that goes beyond the 2-minute maximum, if you could please type that into the chat, then that can be gathered as part of the official record of our meeting, and then that can also be included in the minutes. Did anyone have any questions about the request that we only speak for 2 minutes? Okay, in that case, we will go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Okay, so I really want to emphasize that today our working goal is to make recommendations. So this is our final meeting for us to come together and make recommendations of the items that are on our agenda by the end of the meeting. So we really need to stay focused on talking about those specific items and trying really hard not to kind of go off on tangents that are not directly related to the recommendations that we need to make as part of our subcommittee. Again, if you have additional comments that you would like to make, please make those in the chat, because we can gather those and we can use those in the meeting minutes, and those can also then be talked about and considered as that final draft is being written. So please try to keep oral comments specifically related to items on the agenda. If you do have other comments or ideas that you would like to make that aren't maybe specifically related to those items on the agenda, please make those in the chat so that they can be captured. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the advancement and development priorities and responsibilities, the first thing we really need to consider is how will we scale teachers from basic to proficient on all levels of competency. Now I asked you to pull up the INTASC standards, and if you look at the INTASC standards, you will notice that the way that they are set up and designed is that they are into 3 specific buckets. There's performances, there's essential knowledge, and there's critical dispositions. And then within the actual standards themselves, when you look at each one of the progression standards, you'll notice that they have the performances labeled in 1, 2, and 3. So they're moving from basic to more complicated standards. And so I think that that's a really good kind of way that maybe we could also consider in our discussions of talking about how teachers would progress from the license 1 into license 2 into license 3, moving from basic to more specific or from basic to more complex performances and skills that they would be acquiring as they're moving through the licensure process. So a couple of months ago in one of our discussions, I think it was Patricia who brought up the idea that when we look at these standards, it's really kind of like you're moving in license 1, you are learning, and license 2, you're developing, in license 3, you're proficient, and then in license 4, you have acquired the skills that you need in order to be an effective teacher. And so I think if we kind of also keep that framework in our minds as we're considering how we would move through the different licensure levels, that I think is helpful for us to kind of stay organized and think about how we can move through. For the verification process, specifically, we will be looking at testing, and should testing remain part of the requirements in order to move into the teaching profession, or are there other measures and methods that we could use and indicators that we could use to reduce the barrier of testing? We do know that the standardized practice testing does not correlate to effective teaching practice. So are there other things that we could maybe recommend that would correlate to effective teaching practice that teachers could use to move into the profession? And then also finally, we will look at the movement into the advanced teaching license. How will that be determined? What would be the requirements that teachers would need to be able to demonstrate in order to move into those advanced teaching licenses, so that they are then able to serve as mentors and serve as instructional leaders within their school buildings to help other teachers improve in their teaching practice, and by doing that, help students become better learners. And then finally, we will look at the guidelines for the professional advancement accounts. Next slide, please. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about are going to be those specific competencies for licenses 1, 2, and 3. And so moving from basic to proficient, and then what would that be? So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for comments for that, so we can get some ideas of how would we determine what's basic to proficient, and how would that then be verified? Well, let's start off by getting some ideas on what do we think for someone in a license 1. So moving out of like that apprenticeship license, what would someone, or coming into teaching with very little teaching knowledge and understanding, very few, if any, education classes, with a bachelor's degree but no specific education training, what would that teacher need in order to be in a classroom working with another teacher? The other teacher is a master teacher who would be the teacher of record, but working with another teacher in order to learn the teaching, the craft of teaching.
Maureen, I'm feeling like we've had this discussion. So I also feel like there's information that exists. Are we wanting to look at what we have put together and created to see if we still agree with that, or based on the feedback from others, do things need to change? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Nancy. I'm trying to stay a little bit more kind of like step back and not like directive of kind of like how the conversation goes, that everyone have an opportunity to weigh in. But so this would be in addition to the work we've already done. So all of that work has already been captured, the specific things that we've said that teachers need to have. This is kind of more looking broadly at how would we say you are beginning in license 1, and so you're at a very basic understanding of how to be a good teacher, and then moving to license 2 and then license 3, where you're learning more and more about being a really good teacher, so that when you get to license 4, you can be moved into that professional teacher license, where you are doing a really great job with your kids, you're an effective practitioner, you understand how to meet the needs of all the diverse learners in your classroom. So just kind of talking through like how could that look as we're scaling these from basic to proficient, and then what would we want to say would be the kind of the way that would be demonstrated or shown. So like, is testing the way that we want to say that happens, or are we going to say that like, it's going to be a rubric that's going to determine that, or are we going to suggest that maybe it should be a combination of testing and a rubric? So just kind of opening up ideas for how we would actually scale that. Like, how would that look moving from a license 1 teacher to a license 4 teacher, and then potentially moving into the classroom excellence and the adult leadership if teachers choose to continue on that trajectory. And how would be the best way for us to actually determine that you have met all of those requirements in order to move into the next license level. Does that make sense?
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that we're looking for very specific competencies for each level on a very grassroots thought.
So we've already established a pretty good list of competencies. So like how you would actually need to, for instance, how you would actually need to be able to use data to drive instruction in level 1, level 2, and level 3, right? So now we're kind of looking at here would be, how would we then, like, what would be our recommendation for a way that those competencies could then be kind of bucketed and kind of presented in a way that shows progression, moving from license 1 to license 2 to license 3? Like, what could be the vocabulary that we could use, or the adjectives that we could use that would help us describe, like, I'm moving from license 1 to license 3. Like, so in license 1, I am learning how to use data. Then in license 2, I am maybe demonstrating that I'm developing and being able to use data to drive instruction. And then in license 3, I am maybe competent in meeting the needs of 95% of my students in my classroom. And then in license 4, I'm competent in using data to meet the needs of 100% of the kids in my classroom. So that's what I'm saying. Like, how would we, what are the phrases that we should use that would demonstrate for any of the competencies that we've already discussed and that we've already kind of developed in our work as a subcommittee? What would be the phrases or the words that we should use that would kind of demonstrate the spectrum of moving from, I'm a brand new teacher in license 1 and I'm learning how to be a teacher while I'm working with an expert teacher, to moving all the way to license 4, where I am a highly effective teacher in my classroom who has the skills necessary to meet the needs of my students and have a positive impact on their education.
Maureen, this is Patricia. I put a note in the chat. It would help me to look back at the indicators that we already came up with for the different levels, to be able to get more tangible with what I think you're asking for.
Kim, do we have the meeting minutes handy that we could put in the chat so people could look at that? I'd have to like dig back through my computer to find them.
Sure, I'll look through those as you're continuing this discussion.
So, and I'm not sure exactly, what we're trying to do, but I guess maybe I would add, like, one of the things that you put on the table was, what role should testing play? I really do think that's an important thing for us to think about. And I think that having multiple ways, just kind of like we do for our P12 students, to show mastery is really valuable. So I don't know that test scores need to be the way that you move from one level to another. I would support options related to showing competency.
Awesome. And what would be the options that you would suggest, or anyone would suggest, that we could do other than testing?
Portfolios, a GPA, like, do you need to do a performance assessment in addition to passing praxis exams? I'm not sure that you do. So like, performance assessment, people have different opinions about the testing, the other kind of testing. So, could that be one pathway, perhaps? Successful completion of some kind of internship, or the state has documents that we use when people do go through a traditional EPP that shows competency in different areas. It could be performance evaluation of teachers in classrooms. I'm throwing out lots of ideas.
Yeah, could I piggyback on that just a minute? I'm not looking at all the original. This is Jeff McGarris. Not looking at the other variables. I'm trying to really capture the words for you, and I'm having a hard time doing that. But I would like to say, sometimes it's difficult to measure engagement from the standpoint of the interest of the students in class, and also from a performance base of what they're learning. For example, having a background in career technical education, I had an excellent instructor one time who had a very high rate of placement of students who graduated from his program going into the workforce. They typically performed poorly on some of the tests that were related to he was teaching in welding, and it was tests about some of the ratios, which are critically important, and we constantly tried to work on that. So on the paper and pencil test, if you will, on that, his students that was a constant battle for them to try to show how much they knew. However, from a performance standpoint, they were absolutely incredible, and all the businesses wanted them. And so that's just one small example, but I don't know. And those students were very successful. And so once they left, so I'm trying to capture that from a teacher standpoint of how we're looking at what they're really doing in engagement. And I've struggled with that. And I just really am struggling with the words to try to capture that. So I'm sort of rambling. I apologize, but I don't know if that's somewhat what Patricia was alluding to or not, but that's just some of my thoughts.
No, Jeff, that was great. Thank you very much. And as we kind of have this discussion, I think it's important that we keep in mind some of the feedback that's come from teachers related to this and kind of think through this as we're talking about using things like portfolios or using things like how students are doing on a test. Is that, a lot of teachers are very concerned that some of these things might be considered to be subjective measures that would be outside their control. So like how a student does on a test after you teach them. Like does that, like as Jeff was bringing up, like, maybe you're an excellent teacher, but how do we capture the engagement piece? And then also tying the test or tying test scores to any type of compensation. Now that one really falls to budget and compensation, but I think it's important for us to kind of keep in mind as we're having this discussion of what would be the different things that we think are important to be considered as you're moving through those different competency levels. And then also a real concern with teachers who would not share their resources with other teachers because they would feel like they if they do, then that teacher would then become, I guess, a competitor for them. I do think that we have done a really good job in discussions in our subcommittee and then also in the licensure subcommittee discussions that I've been part of really clearly articulating that this system would be designed to have teachers who are really good at their craft, who would shift into a position where they would become a support teacher for other teachers. So they would be coming into another teacher's classroom who's maybe struggling with any of these things. So for instance, in Jeff's example, maybe there was another welding teacher who did figure out a way to help the students on that test. And so maybe that teacher would then come in and work with the teacher that he was describing just to kind of give them some ideas or provide a different perspective or provide some different strategies or methods of a way that worked in their classroom. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to work in the other teacher's classroom, but that's the collaboration that helps us improve our teaching practice through reflection. And a lot of times having someone else who can come into your room and kind of help you see some of those spaces and places where you have opportunities to improve is really critical in that reflection process for practitioners. I know for myself as a teacher, that is one of the most important things that I could do is to get feedback from my colleagues to understand what they're seeing happening in my classroom because they're looking at it as an outside observer who's coming in and identifying things that maybe me in my classroom all the time I can't see. And so I think it's really important that as we're talking about this, some of this goes to EVA scores, which, is similar to talking about praxis scores, testing in general. But so I think it's really important that we do highlight the importance of having those multiple indicators and multiple ways to demonstrate, whether we're talking about multiple ways to demonstrate effectiveness of practitioners or multiple ways for practitioners to demonstrate their ability to successfully be a teacher. I think the key to this entire model is having the opportunity for there to be multiple ways and multiple indicators that we're using that give teachers options on how they are able to show that they are doing a really good job as a teacher and that they're helping their kids learn.
Maureen, this is Laura. I'll unmute and turn my camera on and share for just a second. Well, it seems my camera's not hitting the right way, but I'll share for a couple of things that are just, as I hear this conversation, I keep going back to right, wrong, or otherwise, how I love the idea of supporting multiple options for folks. And I do think that we should probably make test scores as one of those options because there are a lot of folks who take those tests and are successful at those, and those have been around for a long time. But I also understand that not everybody, that is their best option. But I keep going back to, we can come up with lots of options that are very tailored for individual situations. And I think Jeff's example is a great one. But if the teachers are going to have that kind of input, then I keep going back to this needs to be something that is worked out with the teacher and the principal at the beginning of the year as part of their evaluation process. You know, right now the evaluation process, unless something has changed that I'm not familiar with, and that may be the case, teachers are allowed to bring artifacts. They are allowed to present, here's evidence of my proficiency on the various areas of the evaluation. And what we are talking about feels almost, if it's going to be personalized, which I like that idea, then we go back to pulling it into their evaluation with the principal and allowing them to choose what evidence or what resources they want to share with the principal and how they are evaluated, which seems to always, when we start having those conversations, at some point, either maybe not always in our committee, but in other committees or in notes I read or minutes, whatnot, seems to pull back to we don't seem to have a lot of confidence in that process. So I love the idea of being able to support multiple options for teachers to show their competency, but then how do we track that? How do we allow that? You are moving into the realm of implementation, which there seems to be some resistance to that, but I still continue to push that we need to talk about that, because I don't want us to come up with something that is not able to be put into practice. And going back to the notion of allowing teachers to choose their measures in consult with their principal who is evaluating them and who is probably the person best suited to do that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think that's something that we have to think about. And, I love the idea of allowing teachers to have those kinds of options to think through those kinds of things.
So, and Laura, and this is open to the entire group to discuss, but kind of the way that I see this is we're talking about two separate things. The principal evaluations would remain, that's part of statute. We're not looking to change that statute at all. So principals would still have that same role and the critical role in evaluating teachers in their school and being the person that's providing that guidance as the instructional leader of that school. But this is another idea that gives teachers the opportunity to grow during the school year. So, when I am getting evaluations from my principal, that's happening if it's not a renewal year. That's not happening very frequently. And so that doesn't really give me necessarily the opportunity as a practitioner to see during the school year where I need to improve. Whereas with this model that we're trying to develop, teachers, in addition to still having that summative evaluation from their principal at the end of the school year, would also have the opportunity to have an adult leadership teacher who would be working with them throughout the school year at multiple points throughout the school year to help them improve in their teaching practice. So if on week 2 of the semester, my adult leadership teacher comes into my classroom and identifies a strategy or method that would help me better meet the needs of the learners in my classroom, I can start working on that immediately. Then they can come back 2 weeks later and we can assess where I am. Is that working? Is that something that's benefiting my students? Is that something that's making me a better teacher? If it is, then we look at how do we expand that and continue growing that. If it's not, then we readdress and say, okay, I need to come up with a different strategy or method to meet these kids' needs. Now, happening outside of that work with my adult leadership teacher, my principal would also be coming in and doing my evaluation. So I would now, instead of having only the evaluations for my principal, I would also have this incredible resource with an adult leadership teacher who would also be assisting me in improving my teaching practice, which means I'm not waiting until my summative evaluation to hear from my principal where there may be some areas where I can improve. I'm getting continuous feedback from a colleague who is trained and has the expertise to help me be a better practitioner and help me meet the needs of my students better. And so I don't disagree that the principals are incredibly important and the evaluations that they do are critical to teachers in their teaching practice, and that they are extremely valuable resource for teachers to improve as teachers. But I also think that this gives us another layer of helping teachers improve and better meet the needs of the students in their classrooms.
Maureen, I don't mean to interrupt. I feel like then I'm missing something, because I thought that we were talking about how does a student progress from level 1 to level 2, and what can they show as evidence, like that we were looking for consistent sort of options across moving from license 1 to license 2 and license 2 to 3, 3 to 4. What you are talking about, I perceive as just the normal coaching and mentoring that would go along with the beginning teacher. Those are two different things to me. So I think where I'm getting hung up is, are we talking about what would serve collectively for everybody at license 1? What are the options that would move you to license 2? If we are saying that, you know, hey, if I work on a skill and my advanced teacher person comes in and says, okay, yes, you've met that one, now let's move to the next level, are we saying that that could count as a, okay, now I move to license 2? I think that's where I'm getting confused on what we're trying to do here, because that's not, I agree. I think with the advanced mentor, whatever that role is, sorry, that's my dryer, the advanced role, whatever that is, comes in and coaches a mentor teacher, absolutely. We want them to keep evolving in the practice. If we are talking about what metrics are we going to recommend as a committee that are acceptable to move from license 1 to license 2, that is a different conversation. And so I guess I'm lacking clarity on what we are trying to do here.
Okay, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I was trying to answer your question regarding the evaluations with principals versus kind of like what like this model where I like in my perception in this model, what we're trying to do to change the way we're supporting teachers in their practice. But in this specific conversation, you're right. We are looking at what would we take to go from a license 1 to a license 2, and how would that be validated? So, definitely.
So I just want to be clear. You're suggesting that if the advanced teacher says, yes, they've met it, then that could serve as evidence that they could potentially move to license 2?
So I'm not actually saying anything because this is our group's decision to make the recommendation. But I do think that, like, you know, we can discuss that, but like, that's a great question. If the advanced teacher says, yes, they've met it, are we as a committee going to say that then checks the box for that teacher and that now they've completed that competency? Or do we want there to be some oversight? So the advanced teacher says, yes, they've done it. And then maybe on the end of year evaluation from the principal, they verify that, yes, that teacher has done that. Or on one of the the observations they're doing in the interim throughout the school year, the principal verifies that, yes, they've done that. I think that's a really great question. And so I think that's something that maybe we need to consider making a recommendation on. So if you guys would like to kind of discuss that and see if we can come up with a consensus on how we think we should move forward with that verification process. Does it need to come just from the advanced teacher, or should it be something that after the advanced teacher has said, yes, they've done it, check mark, that somebody else validates that from the administrative side?
I think part of what I heard in this conversation was the idea that the teacher has some ownership of providing evidence that they've done some things. So like when I'm putting these pieces together, I think a rubric has some potential. And the teacher's job is to show evidence that they've done whatever the competency is. The advanced level teacher who's working with them can verify it along with the principal, but I'm really seeing this, like, to me, good teaching is not being amazing all the time, because nobody's amazing all the time. Good teaching is about having some basic skills in place and growing and being reflective and looking at your students and seeing what's working, what's not working, changing. And so for me, to advance from one level to another, it's being in touch with your students, it's being able to show what you're doing to meet their needs and to change the outcomes. So I see advancement not as only something that an outsider evaluates, but as something that the person in the role is part of engaging in. It's like this collective approach, and the mentor is, or the principal, and potentially together are guiding the teacher to help them see strengths and areas of need and take action. Is that making any sense?
Yes.
No, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Now, my next question would be, how would we then move that from basic to proficient as you move across that spectrum of license 1 to license 3?
Well, and that's where we have to get back to the things we've already created, where we said, this is what 1 is, this is what 2 is, this is what 3 is, and then we break it down. Say, from 1 to 2, it's this, from 2 to 3, it's this. I do not mean to be the wet blanket. I also keep going back to,
We want to keep this simple, right? The last thing we want to do is add more complexity to what I feel is already a complex model. And if you have a statute that mandates that these folks are being evaluated by their principal, how can this work interact with that? Like, I love what Maureen was talking about the advanced teachers providing, this feedback, this continuing improvement model to the teacher. To Patricia's point, if I'm a teacher, then I have this work, right? I have this, they talked to me about this, we coached on this, here's what I did, I've got these pieces, I've got whatever artifacts I want to share and create. And for new teachers, they are being evaluated every year, and at least, again, unless something weird has happened. But if I'm not a fully licensed teacher, then I'm getting a full evaluation by my principal multiple times. I'm supposed to be getting it multiple times a year. So the summative, is happening on all standards, with those new teachers. I think that is an opportunity to look at something that's already required, unless there's a recommendation to do something different with how these folks are evaluated. So I am not against, looking at different ways that we could suggest to teachers that they could possibly bring this in, and then how do we use that to support the change in licensure, right? But this idea that there's this smorgasbord of options that teachers can do, now we've got to come up with another way to confirm those options. That to me adds more work somewhere. So whether it's in part of the principal evaluation work, or if it's a different process, that is something that needs to be considered.
Okay, thanks so much for highlighting that, Laura. I appreciate it. Did anyone else have any comments about moving from basic to proficient, and considering how that could look, or maybe how we can ensure, as Laura was saying, that we're keeping things as simple as possible and building within the structure that already exists? Or are there comments about maybe some changes that need to be made to that current structure to better meet the needs of teachers in that continuous process of improvement?
Maureen, this is Jeff again. Let me just ask a question. Maybe this has been answered before. I had to miss a meeting here and there, and I apologize if it's been clarified. Within this process, whether it be principal working with the teacher for evaluation, teacher working with a veteran teacher mentor, all of this, where, and this may be even more difficult to measure, I don't know, but where in this process do we see professional development? And I say that because I'm an old guy, but I remember back in the classroom, one of the many ways that I was to gather ideas on what I hope made me into a better teacher was interaction with colleagues in other venues. And you pick up ideas, and I really don't know how you measure that, because it's somebody could say, oh, well, I went to this conference, and, so what does that mean? So I really don't have an answer. I'm just throwing it out there. I want to hear what some others think. Professional development is valuable for me, and I never want to lose sight of what meaningful professional development can look like. ASCD, regional meetings, whatever. So I'm just curious what others think. I just wonder, where's the role for that in the development of a teacher as he or she hones their craft?
Yeah, excellent question, Jeff. I'll just make one comment and then open it to the floor. So I completely agree. I think that professional development is really important to teachers and their ability to grow as professionals. And that was part of the reason why the professional advancement account was added as one of the pieces of this draft model, to ensure that there were funds available for teachers to be able to select the PD that really meets the needs that they have in order to be a successful practitioner. But instead of making it very rigid in what they need to pick, like right now you have to have a certain number of credits in your content area, a certain number of credits in digital literacy, a certain number of credits in literacy. to be able to kind of expand that so that teachers are able to select the PD that best meets the needs that they have as a practitioner to improve. One thing that I did want to bring up, though, is that NCAE, as part of their feedback, did say, and I'm going to quote this so I don't get it wrong, outsourcing professional development with professional advancement accounts is fiscally irresponsible when existing educators and LEAs can lead their communities in this work while being valued with supplemental pay. So just wanted to throw that out there, too, as something as we're kind of considering what Jeff is bringing up. And this actually goes into another topic we had today. So we can go ahead and start discussing this if you guys would like. I do think it's really important that we do have the conversation around the professional advancement accounts, how those might look, how those classes should be selected, and how teachers would then verify or validate that what they learned in that professional development helped them in their teaching practice.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I will reserve some comments on the NCAE response to that, and I'm a member of the NCAE, but I just I think sometimes on the professional development piece, there's a partnership between the teacher and the principal on what the teacher sees as the professional development they want to take, as well as what the principal feels is something that could be suggested to help in professional development. And the reality, the third piece of this, and I think that may or may not be where NCA was referring, there are some things with professional development that we just have to do. I mean, at the end of the day, we just have to do. That's just my opinion, but I'll stop there.
Thanks for saying that, Jeff. I think that's a really good point. I think that's a very valid point you just made.
Do we have any other comments about professional development, specifically ideas around how maybe the professional development accounts could be utilized by beginning teachers to engage in PD that specifically meets their needs in the classroom? And then also, how would they then demonstrate that by going to that professional development that helped them in their teaching practice, or potentially that they went to a professional development and realized that it wasn't something that was going to help them in their teaching practice, which I think many times is equally valuable because it helps you identify things that maybe you shouldn't try in the future.
Maureen, this is Laura again. That's a really good question, and you're raising, and Jeff too is raising a consideration for me that frankly I hadn't given a lot of thought to, which is what's the conversation with the district on PD, right? Like are we saying that the accounts are completely for the teachers to use at their discretion, which was my take on it, but I hadn't really thought about what happens if the district's got other ideas, or doesn't see. Sometimes we are not all seeing things the same way as what we need to improve on. So that's an interesting. These are raising interesting questions for me. Sometimes the teacher may want PD or think that they need PD, but others may not agree with that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I agree. And I think there are some models in other states where Georgia, for example, where teachers work in concert with their, whether it's their mentor and or their principal, whomever is working with them, evaluating them, providing feedback, that they work together, that the teacher may come with their own plan, but it has to be sort of grounded in this idea of professional improvement. So they come with some, perhaps their own data, evidence, reasons that they want to engage in certain professional learning experiences. And then they, again, in concert with others who, may, and I think this is the difficult part, may and also may not have more insight into what are going to be productive professional learning experiences. for that individual in sort of both the, that it's personalized, but that it's not just, that it's not taking into the context of like, this is like what we see your students needing. Maybe that's not something, you had identified, but something that we think makes sense. And so sort of working together to come up with a plan that is going to sort of both and meet the sort of teachers' individual goals and at the same time be meeting the schools and the goals for the students, the teachers, leading learning for. I will just say also on that note that this idea of vetting of professional learning experiences is not an easy one. So I think just generally we don't have very good, we don't know a lot about in advance what are going to be oftentimes worthwhile professional learning experiences. There are some sort of key core attributes that research has found are critical for professional learning to be impactful for teachers. And so perhaps it's like using those as like guidelines for, any kind of PD that PD accounts are used for, must have, and like there's some, sort of, again, like high level kinds of requirements, that it can't be like a, 1 time, 1 hour workshop, since that is rarely going to translate into sustained learning and or changes in practice, which is ultimately the goal of the professional development accounts being offered to teachers. So I have lots and lots to say about professional development because I've done lots and lots of research on it. But if we want to get more kind of like in the weeds, and I don't know that we do, but about sort of like what those scaffolds about, providing some, again, like teachers can choose, but there is some scaffolding around determining what is in play in terms of, it can't be like truly anything. I'd be happy to, provide resources on that or have a deeper conversation about that.
Yeah, Melissa, I think if you could provide the resources on that, that would be really helpful, especially as we start developing the final draft model. I think that would be great because that would just give us some additional, tools and resources and research to look toward as those final kind of decisions are being made. So if you could email those, that would be great. And then we could email, you could either reply all to the email that Kim sent out so everybody gets them, or you could send them to either myself or Kim, and then we can make sure everyone else gets them as well, just to kind of have an opportunity to look at those and then ensure that those are considered as part of the, like some of those decisions we make in the final kind of draft that we'll send forward as our recommendations to Pepsi.
Happy to do that, sure.
Thank you. And what are some other comments that people have regarding professional development or the use of the professional development accounts? And maybe if you have any best practices or ideas of ways that we would be able to validate the PD or to verify that teachers have learned from the PD, or have some way that teachers are able to provide reflection of the PD and maybe like a plan of how they intend to use what they learned in that professional development as part of their teaching practice, and then collecting evidence from their teaching practice to demonstrate how they actually use that professional development to improve their impact and their ability to reach the needs of their students. Any discussion or ideas around that?
Maureen, I think that's a great question. I think some of it's already built into structures that exist. So an example that comes to mind right off the top of my head is at NCAT, when they're doing some workshops for beginning teachers. In between the times that they come to NCAT, there's stuff that teachers are doing and submitting, like in a Canvas course, and then there are master teachers who are reviewing that. It's labor intensive, but it's built into the PD. So maybe there's some kind of requirement of PD, so that could be part of the PD itself. Again, management can be tricky that way. And so what I'm trying to think holistically and something that's actually able to be implemented. I think about some of the conversation we had a little while ago about, can it be built into the evaluation system that happens in the school? So you have a professional development plan, or you set goals for the year, and in addition to saying you attended PD, you show examples of how it impacted your practice. I also think graduate programs have this built in automatically into coursework. And maybe even sometimes not sometimes, also undergraduate ed prep programs have it built into coursework.
I would just chime in too and say, if we're talking about folks in license 1, 2, 3, to me that is a little bit different conversation than if we are talking about a veteran teacher in year 25. There might be a little more. I mean, I guess overall the general principle of using it to improve your practice is along the same lines, but I think that could be a little more targeted or deliberate, or whatever word you want to use, with folks that are in the license 1 or 2 level versus a seasoned veteran who is in a very different place in their career.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Laura. And just for clarification, right now under the draft model, that professional advancement account is available for teachers in licenses 1, 2, and 3. It would not be something where the teacher would continue to get those funds once they move into license 4. At least that's my understanding. If there's anyone else who had a different interpretation of that, then please unmute and let us know. But that was my understanding, was that that was only going to be for those beginning license tiers, not for teachers that are considered to be in the professional level at license 4.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that clarification.
And Patricia, if you wouldn't mind also doing the same thing that Melissa's going to do, where she's going to send some of the specifics related to the professional development information she was talking about. So maybe if you could provide the NCAT stuff, I can get fairly easily, but if you wouldn't mind providing some specific information around the way that graduate school and EPP undergrad courses are kind of including that accountability and authenticating PD or authenticating learning experiences, that would be fantastic. That way we could also use that as a reference and resource as we're building out the final draft.
Sure, I can do that.
Do we have additional comments? I've noticed there's several people who have put comments in the chat, and thank you so much for doing that. But if you wanted to unmute and discuss anything out loud, then that would be fantastic.
I was about to put a comment in the chat, so I'll just say it out loud instead. And it's just that, while I agree that the level of, direction that a novice versus a veteran teacher needs in terms of, doing some of that self-reflection about what types of professional learning may benefit them, I do also believe that even seasoned veterans can benefit from getting external insight into areas that could improve their practice. I think particularly in, sort of burgeoning areas of pedagogy and the research, like whether it's around teaching literacy or culturally responsive teaching or leveraging various types of technology to engage students. Like, being a veteran teacher, there are many things you may have really honed and developed over the years. It doesn't mean there aren't new things that are coming into the forefront in terms of, again, like our research on like neuroscience and all these different things that they may not be aware of and wouldn't be aware of unless there was, again, some external, some more process of like discussing with others what areas might be useful to them. We all only know what we know. And that is, I think, the brilliance of always working whenever we can in collective with others in our space, because it does broaden our thinking and our opportunities. And so I would hesitate to remove that requirement for veteran teachers just based on years of experience.
And Melissa, thank you so much for highlighting that. And I'm sorry if my comments were interpreted as I was indicating or trying to say that veteran teachers don't also greatly benefit from professional development. But my comment was specifically related to the $2,500 that would be set aside for teachers to do professional development as part of the professional development accounts. That professional development account money would only be for the beginning teacher level. So license 1, license 2, and license 3. But I wholeheartedly agree that as a teacher, I learn every day, and I learn from my colleagues, and I learn from professional development. And the second I tell anybody that I have nothing left to learn as an educator is the day I need to put in my retirement paperwork. So I wholeheartedly agree that veteran teachers do gain a lot from professional development experiences, and that it's very critically important that teachers are continuing to engage in professional development throughout their career, regardless of the number of years of experience that they have. But just that this specific account that we're discussing as part of the draft model is targeted for the beginning teacher levels and license 1, 2, and 3.
Got it. Yeah, I think my comment was more, I think it was Patricia who, and maybe I am misrepresenting who said this, so I'm sorry, who had just mentioned something about, I think it was like the level of kind of like supervision of a teacher. And my apologies because I don't have it up in front of me. So is level 3 the level before you become like a professional teacher? It's still considered the novice.
Yes.
And
license
so level
3,
4 does not get any professional development funds?
So I wouldn't necessarily say that they wouldn't get any professional development funds. That's something that we could suggest to budget and compensation, is that they consider adding in some kind of professional development account for license 4 teachers as well. But for instance, like as a teacher now, my principal usually can find funds to send me to professional development if I come in and talk to her and explain why the professional development would be important for me to go to, how I'm going to utilize that professional development with my students. And so there would probably still be a method to do that. I'm not exactly sure how that works outside of, my own personal experience at the school level, how that funding actually works. But I don't think it's to say that license 4 teachers would not have any opportunity for either their school or their district or to receive a grant to go to professional development, but that those professional development accounts would be specifically designed for the teachers in license 1, 2, and 3. But if we as a group feel that it's important to provide those professional advancement accounts to teachers that are in license 4, that's something we can absolutely as a group submit to budget and compensation for their consideration.
Yeah, I wonder whether, maybe it's just, and again, I don't know sort of what the expectation is for where the professional development account money, the funding would come from for levels 1 through 3, and whether that's different than the funding source for what typically, for example, would fund a professional level licensed teacher in North Carolina. So I guess I'm not sure about like funding sources, but I do think it would be helpful to at least clarify somehow that there would be some opportunity for teachers at level 4 to access professional learning funds also. And honestly, I would recommend really focusing there. I think most of our teachers are going to fall in that bucket. If you sort of think about, I hope that most of our teachers would kind of fall in that bucket. If you sort of like think about the teacher pipeline almost as like a normal distribution, right? I think we would expect most of our teachers, to spend a few years in that novice category, spend most, if not all, of their other years teaching in that level 4 category. And then the, few people who would, maybe not few, but the fewer people who would have a sort of advanced tier license would be in that sort of declining number on the other right hand side of the normal distribution. So I'm just thinking like I think oftentimes we sort of are so worried about like keeping the people in and ensuring that people advance. I think both of those pieces are super important. And I do think that is where the crux of the system should focus at first. But I don't want to neglect that really big, important middle section of our teacher pipeline. And I think part of what will help retain those individuals and keep them engaged in teaching is feeling like they are improving and growing in ways that are, feel both like personally relevant to what it is they're working on, as opposed to say like a district-wide PD day where everybody is focused on the same topic. Some of those might be useful, but they aren't the same thing as a teacher, saying, well, I have a student with this learning need and I really want to learn more about that and dig into that. It's like a really specific area. The rest of my district doesn't necessarily need to learn about it. So that's something I want to do, and just it being really clear and explicit that is something that is expected, honestly, like as part of this system. Isn't that you get to professional 4 and then you are to level 4 as a professional teacher and then you just like hang out. You're just there. That we are trying to encourage and reward teachers for continuous improvement, because again, I think that is ultimately where we will have the greatest success in holding on to that vast majority of teachers in the middle of the distribution.
Yeah, definitely agree, Melissa. Thank you for elevating that and bringing that up. I don't think any of us disagree that our teachers in the professional license 4 would still require professional development. And the entire point of this model is to ensure that we don't have teachers that, as you said, just get to license 4 and hang out. The entire model is designed around teachers continuously improving their practice on a daily basis to meet the different needs of their students and to remain abreast of the newest research and technology, and to be able to find the things that are going to help them be a more successful practitioner and be a better teacher. And so I don't think there's anyone on the call or anyone who's involved in this process of the licensure reform who would disagree with what you said about the importance of teachers being continuously having the opportunities and being rewarded for improving their teaching practice. One other thing too that I saw that came up in the chat, and this is something that Melissa shared as well, and so I just wanted to address it really quickly, is the funding sources. And this is one thing I know there's been a lot of pushback on the fact that we've been talking a lot about policy reform, and we're in the policy reform phase, and then once the policy reform phase ends and we move into the implementation phase. And part of the reason why this has to be separated into 2 distinct categories is because we don't have the full funding picture yet, right? So if we came up with ideas coming out of here that would not be able to be fiscally responsible or financially supported, then that would be a problem, right? So like essentially by developing this kind of skeleton of policy that we're saying, these are kind of the high level big ideas that we think are really important to improve the opportunities for teachers and students in our state. Then if that high level policy piece, the skeleton, gets approved and we know how much money we have permission to start doing the implementation pieces, then we can really dig in and build a system that is going to be really representative of what teachers and kids need in our state. And that's why this has been separated into 2 separate pieces, because we don't have the funding until we have the policy, right? So the policy has to exist in order to find out where the funding is going to come. And that's why this has been separated into 2 separate kind of chunks of work, with the policy piece and construction happening first. And then the implementation piece will follow that if the policy piece is approved by Pepsi, the state board, and the General Assembly. So just wanted to provide some clarification on that as well. Any other comments regarding the professional development accounts, or do we want to make a recommendation to Budget and Compensation that they consider a professional development account potentially for the teachers who are in license 4? Any ideas that you guys have around that?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I don't think it's in our jurisdiction to figure out where the funding comes from. And I think that was the point I was trying to make was that if it is seemingly feasible from a funding perspective, again, sort of like whether that's the same funding that districts already use to fund these kinds of like personalized professional learning opportunities for teachers, or whether it's other funds, I think that we should add a recommendation to at least like explicitly say that every teacher in that framework is eligible for some amount of like personal PD funds.
Hey, thanks, Melissa. Any other discussion around that?
Is it our role to talk about funding? I mean, is that part of our charge?
No, it is not. It is not at all. Like our point, right? So budget and compensation would talk about dollar amounts and kind of work through that. So we can provide some recommendations to them, but as part of advancement and development, we're looking specifically at kind of our roles and responsibilities. Now, of course, there's always going to be overlap because we are talking about the professional advancement accounts. There may be some parts of our discussion that we would need to then forward onto budget and compensation, which we will do that. But it is not part of our role at all to discuss the actual funding or the dollar amounts. We're kind of more just looking at what would the rules be? How would we verify that the professional development was what it needed to be? What would maybe be some guidance or guidelines or like guardrails of where teachers need to stay in order to maintain what the expectation would be for the professional development that they're engaging in. So that's kind of where our conversation is centered. But I will forward that recommendation that Melissa just brought up to budget and compensation, so that when they're having their meeting, they would be able to discuss maybe adding in some funds or recommendation of adding funds for teachers who are in license 4.
Yeah.
Do we have any ideas on ways that maybe teachers would be able to validate or demonstrate that what they learned in that professional development either benefited them in their teaching practice, or like different ways that they could show that the time that they took away from their class or the money that was spent is something that benefited students, and maybe even consider having kind of like a database of professional developments or different learning opportunities for teachers that, like, let's say I need to learn how to teach something better in biology. Could there be like a database that's developed at the state level that teachers could then use to look and see professional developments that other teachers have attended that were really effective? Just some ideas like that to kind of see if we could make the professional development validated and verify that it's working well for the teacher, but also trying to, as some people were talking about, making sure that it's something that's a really good professional development, as Melissa brought up. Maybe finding some way or developing some kind of tool that would help teachers or the adult leadership teachers or administrators or county folks who are kind of helping to organize that professional development, to give them a tool to know where there's some really good resources that teachers have already found and have been using.
Maureen, I think that some sort of a central repository or catalog or whatever you want to call as a resource, I think is a great idea. Probably need a little bit more of that now, just to help folks not be, Google searching, trying to find a workshop or whatever. I get a little nervous about us saying that this is a comprehensive list and this is where you get your PD from, and I feel like there's a slippery slope there. So I am all for providing resources and options. I do not know that I would want a lot more conversation about some sort of a, this is the thing and this is the only PD you can do because this is the only thing that's been validated by somebody else. I think back to my my own experiences, and there's probably been some in-cat experiences for sure that were just more about teacher, teacher rejuvenation on a personal level versus something that I could directly go use with my class. So yeah, I see your comment in the chat. I think that might be a nice, resource. If
Tom,
somebody wanted to start that's a lot of work.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just trying to spark the conversation of ways that we could figure out like how the personal accounts could best be used. But Tom, I see that you have your hand up. If you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm wondering if it's helpful to separate when we talk about professional development. You've got the pieces that are applicable to the licensure process. I don't think this group or the districts would want this group to wade into general professional learning, like setting really prescriptive standards around what professional learning looks like. I don't think that's our role here. I'm wondering, though, if we carve out this piece that says, these are the things that one can do or in order for the licensure system. And I don't even think you need to specify what that professional learning is. It's the outcomes that you're interested in. So you could be agnostic to what tools someone uses to get that learning, but say they have to manifest in some kind of documentation that the person has learned this thing and can demonstrate this skill in the classroom. And that may be a way to avoid trying to get bogged down in what is good PD and what's not good PD, is saying, well, we don't care how you learn it. We're saying that you have to show that you have that competency or skill in the presence of students, and then we give you credit for that. That's where the micro credentials piece, I think, that folks are exploring comes into this.
And who tracks all that, or who? Patricia just asked my question. Who monitors all of that? How does that all get tracked?
Yeah, so that's work being undertaken by the licensure subcommittee right now. Is how do you develop these measures? So like one could say, it could be, as Maureen mentioned earlier, one way you could show that you are demonstrating effective teaching practices is that if your EVOS is at a certain scale. That's one possible measure. Or another way is to say you've got this evaluation, this observational system that verifies that the person is demonstrating these skills in the classroom. Or you could have a system like microcredentials or something similar to the national boards, where you're documenting these practices in the classroom in the presence of students and someone's evaluating that. It's back to the tricky part of who evaluates it, yes. But I think you've got to decide how one moves through this process, and you've got to assume that licensure is going to do its job of saying, here's how that's measured, and here are the options for demonstrating that.
So then I'm a little confused on. Tell me again then what we are doing here, because if we are leaving that part of it to licensure, and then we're also, I hear a conversation that's saying we want to give teachers these options, and that's something they should probably collaboratively develop with their principal/mentor. I'm back to so what are we then nailing down here now?
Well,
we're developing the rules of the PAA, okay?
The professional advancement account.
Okay, so are we saying that here's the things you can, I guess this is where it gets a little weird with the subcommittees, right? Like, I don't want to feel like I just want to be very, very focused on what are we saying. Like an example here would be great. Like somebody tell me an example of what we're possibly could do here.
So what we're doing is we are establishing kind of the like high level rules of the professional advancement accounts. So like, for instance, the recommendation that we have going forward that maybe the licensed 4 teacher should also have some kind of PAA, that would be included in one of those kind of like high level rules. And that teachers would need to engage in PD, that they would then be able to demonstrate in their classroom, and that they would be able to demonstrate what they learned in that by, let's say, collecting curricular activities or data from student learning that demonstrates that what they learned in that professional development seminar that they went to benefited their ability to better reach the students in their classroom. And here's the evidence of how I better reach the students in my classroom. So like, let's say I went to a Google Classroom PD. If I could then take what I learned in that Google Classroom PD, I could then collect evidence from my students to demonstrate that I was able to better meet their needs because of Google Classroom, and then have a way to report that. That's kind of what we're looking at, or kind of those high level pieces. Now, just like with the budget and compensation conversation, we will have some crossover here with licensure. So anything that crosses over that licensure would need to be aware of that came out of our conversations related to the professional advancement accounts will then be passed on to licensure so they can consider those comments or those ideas in their work.
So I think this is helpful because I am concerned that we are careful about, to me, there's a difference between a short term, and I'm not even talking about, Melissa mentioned earlier, like a day. I'm talking about like a short term unit or 2-week activity that results in the end of it, I can do something, and that's going to count to move me to another license because I've demonstrated the competency. So I think we need to be very careful about that. And I'm just, because my background is EPP, I'm going to use an EPP as an example. If I have a student, like we've got a course that I'm thinking of, just one of my courses that the students take, related to planning and assessment. So if I do some of the units within that, if I look at those units and they are very comprehensive, they all have learning standards, they all have learning objectives, it's very clear on what the outcomes are, and there's some evidence at the end that our students go into classrooms and they collect real data from real kids, and they're able to show that they were able to track assessment data. They started a student at the beginning point. They're able to move those students. That's like a 2 or 3 week, part of a bigger class. I would not want someone to be able to take that one class and do 2 or 3 of those units, and suddenly they're able to move to license 2. The same way I would not want someone to be able to complete a couple of micro-credentials and move from 1 to 2. I think that is a different conversation. So if we're talking about PD things that build, and we're talking about, a comprehensive view of how are you able to put all of those pieces together into being a teacher, that is different than are you able to meet this short-term objective, or do we want multiple layers of those? I think Patricia said earlier, there's more to being a teacher than just being able to do these things. We're looking at that holistic piece. So maybe that's where we are going to, that's where the objective was to go today. But I would be hesitant about how those PD pieces work together, I guess, to move you from one license to the next. I don't think that I would be supportive of you complete this, and maybe there's a bigger alignment chart here on, going back to our original conversation, that clarifies a little more for me, what are we looking to do here? I don't know if I'm starting to ramble a little bit, but if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and I'll have other people weigh on this as well if they want to add more to this. But the entire purpose of this model is outcome driven. So whether your input is PD, whether your input is you worked with the adult leadership teacher and they helped you become a better practitioner based on research-based methods and strategies, whether you have sought out working with a colleague, or you're developing your own curricular materials that are aligned to what your students need and you're going to use that, the bottom line idea here is that in order to move from one license level to the next, you need to be demonstrating that you are continuously improving the kids in your classroom 3 out of 5 years. That's the idea. Like that's what we mean by the outcome based. Now we want to give teachers lots of different options of how that could work. We know that professional development is one way that teachers can gain some skills and learn some new strategies and methods that may benefit the students in their classrooms. But those strategies and skills may not benefit every single student in their classroom. So teachers are going to have to engage in other ways of learning and other reflective pieces of their practice, working with that adult leadership teacher and working with the instructional team at their school to help them continuously find ways to meet the diverse needs of every single student in their classroom. So PD will be one of those ways. There'll be other ways that will happen as well. No one is saying that if I take a class on, again, Google Classroom, that check marks off that I'm proficient with technology and now I move on. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is if I'm able to use the information that I learned in that professional development course, along with all of the other things that I'm doing, that I'm learning from the adult leadership teacher, that my principal is helping me with, that the classroom excellence teacher who is leading my PLC is assisting me with, that all the different things that go into effective teaching practice. And we know that is a composite picture, and that picture looks different for every teacher in every classroom. So using all of those different inputs that are coming in to help teachers really become really excellent practitioners who are meeting the needs of their kids, then there needs to be some way that is then being captured and saying, hey, that Google Classroom really helped me do this thing with my kids, along with that I implemented this new item analysis data strategy that I learned from my adult leadership teacher. And then I was able to use the data that I got back from the quizzes I was giving in Google Classroom, along with that item analysis, to be able to holistically meet the needs of the kids in my classroom. So we're not talking about singular things. And when we're talking about the professional accounts, what we're really looking at is if we're going to give teachers $2,500 a year in order to engage in professional development, what need to be the rules around that money that's being given to them to make sure that money is being spent in a way that is authentic to what kids need in classrooms and what teachers need to improve their professional practice. So Tom, did you still have your hand up, or did you re-raise your hand?
No, I'm sorry. That was just, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. So Melissa, go ahead, please. Melissa, did you want to say something?
I'm sorry. I was talking to myself on mute. I was just saying I generally agree with everything that everyone shared. I do think it's still unclear to me if license renewal is part of our jurisdiction or not. And if it is, and I think this is like where we were sort of focused on the level 4 license and whether those folks got a professional learning account and sort of what does it mean in the context of the licensure framework for there to be a professional growth focus for that level in particular. And so I think that, license renewal isn't something we've talked much about, but I think it makes sense for that to be within our purview as a subcommittee. I know it's not technically advancement, but it is professional growth. And so I think that makes sense for us. And I, agree that generally we don't want, one competency to necessarily be the reason you move from one license level to another. But I do think, and this is sort of where this idea of like professional growth plans come into account, that for like, again, a professional level teacher, that we would want, there to be a specific goal that you've chosen that you have then demonstrated your ability to implement a better practice in the classroom, and that would be what is actually tied to your license renewal, as opposed to I gathered a bunch of credit hours in some various things. I don't have to demonstrate that I did anything with any of the knowledge that I was imparted to me in those in those sessions, only that I went to them. And so I do think that in this sort of overarching shift toward a focus on competencies across the licensure continuum, that license renewal also needs to make that same shift. So that is my proposal.
Thank you, Melissa. And we'll make sure that gets sent to licensure as well so that they can consider that. Right. Is there any more discussion around ways, because I think it's really important that we include in this discussion of like what the rules should be for the professional advancement accounts, that we're really considering like what would be the way that teachers would then be able to say, yes, by going to this professional development, I learned something that benefited my students. So what are some ideas that we have for ways that we could make that happen, that we could demonstrate based on a teacher going and learning something that what they learned helped their students? Or is that, you know, because sometimes, like I said, you could go to a professional development that you realize doesn't really meet your needs or your students' needs. What would be maybe the process that we would need to go through for a teacher to either demonstrate that this did help their kids, or to say this didn't help my kids and here's why, and here's kind of my path forward, since this particular professional development experience that I went to is not really going to benefit me and my students, here's my next steps to find something else that will.
So Maureen, if we're just talking generally around some broad rules for the professional spending accounts, okay? And I would love for the P12 folks on the call, if there are any, to weigh in here. If I were generally talking about some spending rules, we're talking about new folks. They have never been in a classroom before, ostensibly. They, in my opinion, will need some guidance on that. So I don't think that we want to just let the teachers say, hey, go pick whatever seems to suit your fancy. I think we need to include some recommendations that they collaborate with their mentor, and that their final PD plan, which is, to me, that's what this should be, is this should be a focused plan for moving forward, should be approved by their principal. And I say that knowing, having, you know, I spent some admin years along the way. I get it that principals can't sit down and always have the time to, you know, go over a detailed plan with everybody in general, but there are mentors who can make those recommendations, and then the principal can review that, and some will take a bigger interest in that than others, but it just feels like there needs to be that level of oversight, especially with guidance for new folks. That would be my first thing. And I also think that we need to think about, and I don't know if this has been a discussion or not, but there are definitely going to be initiatives at the district level, or initiatives that district folks feel like maybe all their beginning teachers should focus in on X or Y, because as a district, we've seen that is a concern. So it may be that there are some things that even their district folks want to push for them to look at with these accounts. So I think part of the question for me is, how much autonomy do the teachers ultimately have, or are we saying that this is something that needs to be developed collaboratively? I would hope that would be sort of understood, but to your point, we probably need to be a little more explicit around the expectations on those funds and how they're used. I also don't think it's unrealistic, and let me just throw this in while I'm talking. I'm going over my 2 minutes, but this goes back to kind of what we had at the beginning of this conversation. I think Patricia said something in the chat around this. If you start this at the beginning of the year, to come back at the end of the year with those evidences, and if it's been clear to the teachers, you know, here's at the end of the year, we want to hear how your PD went, and we want to see what kind of, how you used it and what the impact was, and that's going to be part of our end of the year summative conversation. And that the mentor is having that conversation with them throughout the year. You know, it's sort of an ongoing thing with the mentors and how they're talking with them about the impact of this PD. I think that is not an unrealistic expectation to ask teachers to show us that as part of their annual evaluation. Again, I get very hesitant about adding additional processes and making this more complex. If we can work this into something that's already happening, that feels like a much better way to go.
I do think Laura touched upon several things. I do think that it's going to be important to just keep it in mind that there will be some district initiatives that professional development that are just going to occur. I see and hear firsthand sometimes there may be some things that not everyone likes to do, but we know that we need to do them. During the start of the pandemic, we saw some of that with some of our, remote learning work. There are things that are going to have to be done. I mean, we're doing letters training. We're doing all sorts of things. These have to be done. And I don't want to sound harsh, and I wish I had a better way of saying this, but they have to be done whether people want to do them or not. And we just have to. By the same token, I think there has to be a collaborative discussion between the principal and a district's going to have a strategic overall plan, and then the school's going to have their school improvement plan, and then there needs to be a discussion between the teacher and their colleagues, as well as the principal, on what is some meaningful professional development to go to. And it may be that they go to some development and it turns out that it's not, they didn't think it was great. They don't know how it's going to be helpful. That's going to happen, unfortunately. And that's a reflection on feedback that they can give, and maybe that provider then does a better job the next time. I don't know. But by the same token, I think we will get in trouble, and this is probably not going to be popular with a few folks, maybe, but I think we've got to be very careful that we just open it up and say, I go pick what you think you need, because we're tying funds to this, and that may or may not go well. Just a word of caution.
Maureen, this is Jeff, and two quick things on the discussion. So I've always thought, and maybe it's my misunderstanding, that these professional development funds would be additive to anything that's currently happening in the district or the school, and to funds that are currently being provided at the state for professional development. So it wouldn't replace district professional development or school professional development. It would be something that teachers could use to target their own individual needs and growth, separate and apart from any requirements at the district or state level. So I don't know if that's the way this subcommittee feels, that we need to clarify that as part of our recommendations. That's always been my understanding. And I know when I was a teacher and a beginning teacher and we had a professional growth plan, it was great to sit with my mentor and to figure out what I was going to do. But then I had no resource to then use to pursue what I felt like I needed to work on. It was sort of either on my own dime or on my own time to try and figure it out. And so that, to me, has always been the idea of this professional development account, is that it's for that individual thing and not to replace any district or school-wide kind of PD. Because I think, to the previous discussion, there's always going to be a district focus. There's always going to be a state focus like it is right now with letters, and sometimes a school-level focus. And so those things would be separate and apart from this individual growth. The second thing I wanted to share, and just to make sure that this is part of the conversation, is I've also always thought that this professional development account could be used for tuition costs if a teacher decides they want to pursue licensure only program or a course at an EPP or whatever that would be. So I think that would need to be included as part of the rules. Again, if the subcommittee agrees, that would be an appropriate use of these funds, is to help to cover those costs if that's the choice or is decided, in consultation with the principal and the mentor, that that's the appropriate path for this teacher to take.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing both those up, Jeff. And definitely, you read my mind, because I was getting ready to unmute and explain that the kind of intention of the PAA would be for additive. So anything that was required by the state, required by the county or LEA, required by the school, that this would be additional PD that beginning teacher would have the opportunity to pursue above and beyond the things that are already being done within their local school district or the state level. And in addition to what Jeff said about the the being able to use it for tuition, which I don't think is something we've brought up yet, and I really like that idea. So we can definitely see if everyone's on board with that, and then pass that along. But another thing that I thought would be, and we have discussed this one a couple of times in this committee, is that those teachers would be able to also use that money to hire a mentor if they felt like there was somebody that could help them, that they really wanted to be able to lean on, but they also wanted to compensate them. So that's another thing that we could consider. So like, it could be somebody who's not from my school. Maybe it's a college professor that I had. Maybe it's someone that I know from another state. Maybe it's someone that I know from another district, but that teachers would also, if they feel like there's someone who would really be able to benefit them in growing in their practice, that they could have the autonomy to use that professional development account to pay someone to serve in that mentor role for them. So let's open up for discussion on those two additive things. I see Melissa has her hand up, so go ahead, Melissa.
I love all these ideas. I think that Jeff's suggestion to cover tuition makes sense, because that is also, one way that teachers will gain skills, and is probably like one of the better vetted tools that we have in place to gain competencies and skills. My one concern, because part of my job is always looking for unintended consequences of policies. But one concern I have about the, sort of just like, oh, if you find a mentor or somebody you want to pay to do this, I guess I just wonder whether there will be like any type of like backstop or vetting or something in place, just mostly to ensure that like people don't get taken advantage of, whenever there's sort of like, quote unquote, free money, like floating around. There's always like the opportunity for people to like think, oh, I can, make some money off this, and I'm going to like set up shop to, offer my services, but like, I don't actually have much evidence that I'm going to help impact your practice. So I know, that our ultimate goal is not to be like, maybe Nancy or Patricia commented in the chat that, we're trying to like evaluate all the different pieces provided, but I do get a little concerned when we start talking about like opening it up to like anything and everything. And so I guess I'm just wondering if we can put some sort of like backstop in place that, and again, maybe it is just the like consultation between the teacher and, their mentor or advisor, whomever, but yeah, I mean, we've just seen like whether it's like for-profit colleges taking advantage of veterans, or like there's just lots of situations when there's sort of like free money on the table, people find ways to access it. And I just want to ensure that we're sort of thinking about that piece as we open up opportunities for these professional advancement accounts.
Melissa, this is Jeff. I'm sorry I got dropped off the call there. I agree with you, and I think if we're allowing it to be used for tuition purposes, I think it would only be allowed to be used at state board approved EPP programs, so that at least maintains that level of quality that you're talking about. And maybe there's some similar way to structure something for either PD or the mentor or something along that. I don't think we have anything in place now, but I would say that at a minimum, it should at least be, if it's being used for tuition, for tuition at a approved EPP program.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I think that's a really important clarification. Maureen, I just wanted to say really quickly, I have to leave a little early to make another meeting, but I appreciate the conversation today. I think it's been good. I know the meeting is supposed to end at 11 o'clock, but I wondered if there is still the intent to move forward with presenting a final model to PEPSIC in September.
Kim, do you mind unmuting and kind of explaining the process moving forward of how we're going to let all the subcommittee members know what the final draft model will be? Okay, so Kim might have stepped away. I'm going to go ahead and do my best to kind of let me go back to my
sorry, Maureen, I'm here.
Oh, okay,
I'm sorry.
okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you.
Yeah, no problem. So I was just saying, so Laura had just asked about kind of like what the plan is to give the full model presentation to Pepsi. So I was wondering if you could just do like a quick overview of kind of what the plan is for the subcommittee members to be able to see the final draft model before it actually goes to a vote at Pepsi.
So I have recently talked to Dr. Dempsey, and he had collaborated at the time. Dr. Miller was still chair, so they collaborated together, and they talked about that the subcommittees would be able to receive the link to the full Pepsi Commission discussion meeting where will be initially presented as a discussion item, and then they are welcome to provide any type of response to it between that meeting and the action meeting, which would presumably be the next month. But they thought that would be the best step, is for them to hear it during the full commission meeting.
Does that answer your question, Laura?
It does. I'm not real thrilled about that idea, to be honest. Feels like we're still, there's a lot of open questions, but it may be the commission's decision to just take the model with the committee feedback where it is, and then they are going to refine forward, and it's entirely within their prerogative to do that. I acknowledge that. I don't know, I guess I'm feeling a little bit unsettled and rushed. I mean, even today we've had a lot of conversation that just feels like there's a lot of moving parts still. But the commission has the prerogative to handle it however they choose. So I acknowledge that. I'm just not feeling very settled. But again, that's me.
Well, and Laura and everyone, keep in mind that there's still plenty of opportunity to provide feedback. The joint co-chairs meeting, I think, is on the 25th. There are still other subcommittee meetings that will be held this week and next week. And so, you can either send feedback about open questions you still have, areas that you think that we still need to provide improvement on, maybe ideas that you've heard speaking with colleagues, or ideas that you've come up with in your own that have come out of conversations that either we've had in our meetings or conversations that you've heard in other subcommittee meetings. And you can send that feedback to that Pathways email address that's collecting all the feedback to make sure that those concerns continue to be elevated, continue to be heard, and continue to be raised. One thing that I think is incredibly helpful as people are sending in that feedback is if you are able to provide specific examples of flaws. So like tell us specifically where there is an issue that you see. That way we know what needs to be addressed and what needs to be discussed. And if possible, if you can provide a solution, that's even better, because that kind of helps us see how what's a path forward. If there's a problem that you see, what is an idea you have that would solve that problem as well? That's incredibly helpful. And so while there's definitely still work to be done, we all acknowledge that. Having people that are still continuing to provide that feedback and helping us to frame out that model will be really important and helpful. And I think if people are able to listen in on the August 25th co-chairs meeting, and then provide some insight based on what they hear in that meeting, because we'll have even more solid material and ideas going into that meeting that we had and the meeting that we had the beginning of this month. And so I encourage everyone to continue providing that feedback, continue to provide solutions along with that feedback, so that we're able to develop a model that is really inclusive of what teachers and students need, so that we are able to provide more opportunities for kids to grow in their learning and for teachers to grow in their practice. Did we have anyone else that wanted to add additional comments around the professional advancement accounts? Okay, so in that case, I did want to go back. Nancy had posted in the chat a while ago about student surveys and wanting to have some discussion around the student surveys. While the student surveys don't particularly fall necessarily under our discretion solely, that is going to potentially be one of the indicators that licensure will decide will be something that would enable someone to move forward and as part of the student outcomes. And since we're charged with saying that you must show growth in 3 out of 5 years and show growth in order to move between the beginning 1, 2, and 3 licensure levels. And we've already made that determination that the expectation would be that teachers would show and demonstrate growth with their students and show that they're continuously improving their kids. I think it's valuable for us to have a discussion around that as well, so that any ideas that come out of our subcommittee could then be forwarded to licensure as part of their final discussions around how student surveys may be one of the indicators that could be used to help demonstrate a teacher's ability to grow. So if I could just add one thing real quick before we start that discussion around the student surveys. I know that there is a lot of concern and legitimate concern that student surveys would be almost like a popularity contest for teachers. So like Miss Stover is nice to me, and so I like her, and so I'm going to give her a good evaluation. There was also several teachers in the feedback who did provide some concerns around different things that may come out of student surveys, like for instance that they teach middle school or high school students, and that they're concerned that their students may make a decision based on their popularity, or that we're putting the pay and licensure of teachers in the hands of our students. So there's definitely a lot of concern that we did see come out of the feedback that I think we definitely need to address to ensure we're developing, if we choose to go forward, and by we I mean licensure, choose to go forward using the student surveys, that those concerns are addressed, and that the system that is developed would be considering those concerns and the feedback from teachers centered around student surveys. I think it's really important to acknowledge that student surveys are based around the student's learning experience in a classroom. So, for instance, Ms. Stover, the question could be, Ms. Stover is good at giving an alternative explanation when I don't understand something she explains in class. Now, that's something that comes up frequently in biology, because sometimes it's a complex idea or a complex concept that students have not been introduced to before. And if it is only explained in one way, that means that many of the students in my classroom would not necessarily understand what I just explained to them. And so being able to develop alternative explanations to meet the needs and to be able to reach all of my learners is a really, really important skill that I, as a biology teacher, need to develop in order to be an effective practitioner. So if in the first 9 weeks or the first quarter of my biology course, if I get student feedback from my kids that says that I am not doing a good job of giving them alternative explanations in complex concepts, then that's where my adult leadership teacher would come in and look at that student survey data with me. They would say, okay, Maureen, so you're really struggling with coming up with alternative ways to explain things to your kids so that you're able to meet them and so they're able to understand what you're talking about. So let's talk about some different ways in your lessons that you're going to teach here in the next 2 or 3 weeks that we could come up with some alternative ways for you to explain these really complex concepts. So let's first identify what those hard to understand concepts may be. Let's go look at National Science Teaching Association, or let's go look at the National Science Foundation and find some alternative explanations that you could embed. Are there some activities that you could use to reinforce after you've done whole group instruction to explain a concept that you could use to reinforce and help your kids understand those concepts better? So let's figure that out. Let's include those into your lesson plans. Do you need me to come in and do a model lesson to show you how to actually implement those strategies in your classroom? Okay, if that would be helpful, let's schedule that so that you can watch me teach it first period, and then you can teach it second and third period. Now, when I get my second 9 weeks or my second quarter evaluations from my students, if I see that now my students are saying that I have improved in my ability to provide those alternative explanations, that's demonstrating that I am improving in my professional practice. And if my students are understanding the material I'm explaining better, that means that now I'm going to be able at the end of the school year to have a better opportunity to demonstrate growth in my students' ability to learn. And one of my evidences could be that I took the information from the student surveys, I made these changes in my teaching practice. Because of these changes in my teaching practice, my students understood this concept better. So that's kind of the idea behind the student survey. So I just wanted to kind of add that as a kind of an explanation of the vision of the student surveys and how they could be useful for teachers to improve their teaching practice and improve student learning. And then I'll open up the floor for anyone else who would like to have some comments about student surveys, elevating concerns, and any feedback you have about student surveys.
Maureen, I think student surveys can be an effective tool if structured in the manner that you're talking about. I think that actually, a good instructor many times is soliciting feedback from their students anyway. It's part of a broader thing with the relationships you're establishing with your class, also the communication you're doing with your parents. It's a broad-based approach on that. And so I think they can be effective with a lot of other factors that we would think would be effective included. I just say that because it would be important that we would never get into something about, rate my teacher. Do I like them or not? Are they nice or not? And a personal example, I'm probably oldest one in here right now, but I remember a teacher I had in the late 70s in high school, and she taught geometry, and she was infamous. Everybody knew her. She was very tough. She was very structured, and there were times we did not like her. In fact, that was before state testing, but you learned math or you died. That's the way she approached her classes. And I didn't really appreciate her, but I got through the class. And then I became a freshman in college at NC State, and I'm sitting in a math class and people are struggling, and I'm thinking, this is not difficult. And that's when I appreciated the way that teacher approached everything she did with the follow-up, the parent communication, making sure she stayed to make sure I knew what the concepts were. But it took a while to get to that. And so I only say that as an example. It's got to be and make sure it's a broad approach that, it also encourages relationships. I do think it can be effective if it's structured the way that you just described.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. And in this idea of restructuring and changing the policy around licensure, that's the idea, is that we're giving teachers the tools that they need to identify where they need to improve in their teaching practice to better meet the needs of their kids in their classrooms. But in addition to that, providing them the support with that adult leadership teacher who is able to come into their room and help them understand how to use that information. And so I think the point that you bring up there, where sometimes we don't realize how much a teacher has impacted us and our ability to learn until after they're no longer our teacher, is a really valid point. And that's why this way that the student surveys are written are centered around the students learning, because probably your response to your math teacher, geometry teacher's ability to give you that alternate explanation when you didn't understand something, or finding a way to connect with your parents if you needed additional support or help, those things you would have answered that she was doing those for you. And then she would have gotten positive feedback on that practice was benefiting the kids in her classroom, versus maybe another math teacher in your school who wasn't doing those same things. Maybe that would be an opportunity for them to grow in their practice to better meet the needs of the geometry students that were that they were the teacher of record for. Okay, so we have about 2 minutes left. Just wanted to see if there's any final comments that anyone wants to make. Again, you can also put stuff into the chat if that is a better way for you to provide those final comments.
Maureen, this is Patricia. I wanted to explain a little bit about the comment that I put in the chat a few minutes ago. I really do appreciate the conversations that we've had. I also still feel like things are very nebulous, and when I had put something at a basic level, what is the model in the actual documents and graphics? So obviously there's, the graphic that we've been looking at, and then there's been some different versions that have come out. When I was thinking about your question earlier about how will we, have things that help us know that people can advance from one level to another. And I asked the question, can we go back and look at what we said the criteria are for each of the levels? Like, there's lots of work that's been done, but I don't know where to go to find a summary of like where we are, if that makes any sense. So that's just something I wanted to say out loud, because I think it could be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And I think the best place to go for the summary of all the work that's been done is to reference the meeting minutes that you've received from like over the past 18 months. And then also all of the materials from all of the subcommittees are part of public record. And so there, you can also go and see kind of where the crossover or overlap is with the other subcommittees with the work that we've been doing. And then, the straw man that came out in, I guess, February-ish timeframe earlier this winter, that straw man documentation was kind of based on the conversations that had been going on within the subcommittees up until that point. And so that might be a good starting point to look at. And then kind of like move forward from there to see conversations that have come out of that initial kind of straw man draft that was presented a couple of months ago. So, and I do know, like my husband jokes, but it's really almost kind of true that my wall in my office looks similar to like one of those people that's a conspiracy theorist where they've got like yarn and like Post-it notes and newspaper articles up all over the place. That is legitimately how the wall in my office looks. So I understand that it's complicated, that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of information that we've been having conversations and discussions about that right now may not seem like it's fully connected. But I do ask people to kind of stick with us as we continue working on pulling all of these pieces and conversations and ideas and concerns and feedback together so that we're able to pull that all in to a model that is the best representation of what teachers and kids need in our state in order to have successful public education. And so I know we're on the right path. We've had a lot of really great conversations. We've had a lot of really hard conversations. And I think each of those are very important. And all of the feedback that each of you has provided, the conversations, the concerns, the ideas have been really important to developing what will be the model that goes forward to Pepsi here in the next couple of months. And so, again, I encourage you, if you have ideas, feedback, concerns, things that you would like to add or things that you think are pressure points, to please continue sending those into the feedback email. That way we're able to collect those and consider those as part of the final model that will go forward to Pepsi out of the subcommittee work. And so just one more check to see if there's anybody that has any last comments. And if not, I appreciate all of you being here with us today. And I can't wait to hopefully see you guys in person at some point here in the future. And again, thank you so much for all of your inputs, your ideas, your thoughts, the hard work that you've done over the past 18 months to help us really hone in and figure out the best ways for us to really look at licensure reform in a way that's representative of all of our stakeholders, from district partners, EPPs, kids in classrooms, teachers in classrooms. It's really greatly appreciated, all the time and effort that you've put into this project. Okay, Kim, so it seems like we don't have any additional comments, so we can probably go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you so much.
Did you want to?
Oh, we have to adjourn. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Sure.
Can I please get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So move.
Thank you. And if we get a second?
Second.
Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned, and we appreciate all of your work on this project. Thank you.